Hello, good evening, everyone. I'm Paul at the Garland County Library, and we're here tonight with the latest installment in our Garland County Master Gardeners Know It to Grow It program series. And tonight's program is about native bees, and it's not the first or the last bee program that we're ever going to host, but there's always an interest in bees, so that's why we're here. This program is here by popular demand because it seems like our viewers love bees. First of all, let me say hello to Judy Dare, who's the chairperson with the Garland County Master Gardeners. And Judy's going to be presenting our guest presenter here shortly. But first, both Judy and I have some opening announcements. And I'll begin with mine. But Judy, first of all, hello. Thanks for joining us.
Hello, Paul. Good to see you.
As always. I first want to start with mine real quick. Since today's program is all about native bees, it's the perfect time to announce an upcoming library event. And let me get that flyer up here. There we go. On Wednesday, September 22nd, which just happens to be the first day of fall, we're going to have some local beekeepers who are going to have some of their honey and an observation hive with live bees. And they'll be selling jars of honey while supplies last, hopefully from 11 a.m. to 2 p.m. That's Wednesday, September 22nd. Sales are cash only, and that's the Greater Hot Springs Beekeepers Association representatives from there. So I hope you show up and show them some support. And of course, you have to wear a mask while you're in the building at the library, but just come and enjoy some honey. So that's what I have. And Judy, you have some announcements as well, and that's the
You know me, I always have some. So good evening, everyone, and welcome to Know It to Grow It. We're really glad that you're here. As Paul said, tonight's program is all about native bees, and it's going to be presented by our returning friend, Leslie Cooper. And we will get to those bees in just a moment. First, I'd like to congratulate Paul Kagebein. Paul has earned a spot in the upcoming Leadership Hot Springs class. I think it's awesome. Leadership Hot Springs is a 9-month program whose goal is to develop competent leaders for tomorrow by exposing its members to business and community leaders. It examines realities and opportunities in Hot Springs, and I'm just really proud for Paul. Kudos to Paul, and I know he's really excited about being in the program. For those of you who frequent the library, please check out the work being done on the library courthouse. The library and the Master Gardeners of Garland County are renovating the courtyard into a pollinator and birding area. When it's completed, it'll be a lovely way to watch nature at work. They're taking out all of the knockout roses, which, though lovely, don't really bring anything to the pollinators, and putting in pollinator plants and birding plants. So it should be really fun to watch. So check that out. Now, if you'd like to become a Master Gardener, please remember to pick up an application at the Garland County Extension Office. That's at 236 Woodbine. And all the applications need to be returned by November the 15th, and then classes will start in February. And the classes are fun and interesting. Unfortunately, because of COVID, they will be virtual, but the things that you'll learn through the Master Gardener program are just eye-opening and mind-expanding. So think about becoming a Master Gardener. We'd love to have you. Our next Know It to Grow It will be on October 20th at 6 o'clock with Garland County Master Gardener Debbie Tripp. She is a proprietor of Rosemary Herb Farm in Crystal Springs, and she is an herbalist. And she will present Herbs of Our Ancestors, and that discusses medicinal herbs throughout the ages. So that should be a really fun and interesting program as well. So please remember to type your questions and comments into the chat box. The first 3 to do so will receive one of our famous Know It to Grow It gift bags, and they can be picked up at the library tomorrow morning after 10. Now, I would like to take a moment to thank someone at the library who does a great job for Know It to Grow It. Paul is showing some of our Know It to Grow It flyers. They are the work of Erin Baber. She is the public relations and marketing manager, and they are really beautiful. I want to recognize and thank Erin for the work she provides to us each month, and let her know how much we appreciate her, because she really does wonderful work. Thank you, Erin. They're beautiful. All right, now on to the bees. We are happy to have Leslie Cooper back with us. She is the Monarch and Pollinator Coordinator for Quail Forever. Leslie holds degrees in science, fire ecology, and conservation biology. She has been a wildland firefighter and has worked many research programs related to ecology and environmental quality. Leslie is based in Little Rock, where she lives with her husband Adam and her new fur baby Dot. An Idaho native and outdoor enthusiast, she enjoys exploring Arkansas and learning about Arkansas native species, and is happiest when she has a drip torch in her hand. Please welcome Leslie Cooper.
Thank you, Judy, so much for the wonderful introduction. And I'm so excited to be with you all live this time and presenting about native bees and talking about the buzz on our busiest pollinators. So first, I'd like to meet the pollinators. So there's 6 main groups. There's butterflies, flies, moths, wasps, beetles, and bees. And of course, there are, vertebrate pollinators, but we don't have any that are in Arkansas, except for, of course, hummingbirds. But these are the main invertebrate categories. So of these 6 main groups, bees are the only pollinators to consume pollen and nectar as larvae and adults. So they're the only pollinators that intentionally move pollen throughout the landscape. So due to that, they really are the most preeminent pollinators that we have. Unfortunately, our pollinators are in decline. I mentioned those vertebrate pollinators, and almost 17% of them are threatened with extinction globally, and greater than 40% of our invertebrate pollinator species may be facing extinction, and particularly the bees and the butterflies are the most at risk. So bees, they're the insect order Hymenoptera, and this is the same order that includes bees, wasps, ants, and sawflies. And there are 7 families of bees worldwide. There are 6 that are found in North America, and the 7th occurs only in Australia. And I would attempt to pronounce all of these, but I'm not a native bee researcher, so I won't do that since this is being recorded. However, if you are interested in learning more about these insect families, there's a couple webinars that I'd really like to recommend. The first one is Identifying Native Bees with Olivia Carroll. It's great. It's from Ohio State, and she covers the key characteristics from all these different native bee genera. And she is also the co-author of Bees in Your Backyard, which is a book that I'll be talking about later. And you can just find it on YouTube, just search the title, and it was uploaded April 18th of 2018. But it's still great content. The next one actually is an overview of Arkansas native bee communities. You can find it on the Arkansas Monarch Conservation YouTube channel. Coleman Little, who's a researcher at UCA, covers the diversity of bees in Arkansas, the different social structures of those different groups, nesting habitats, and taxonomic groups in Arkansas that I am not as well equipped to say, but it was a part of the 2020 Arkansas Monarch and Pollinator Forum that was held last November. The last one that I wanted to add in, there's a great webinar that was hosted by the Natural Areas Association. Rich Hatfield with the Xerces Society did a great webinar in 2019. It covers pollinator decline, honeybees in natural areas, and different pollinator interactions. So first things first, I know that Judy and, that Judy had talked about upcoming honeybee events with beekeepers coming to the library. I'm super excited that that's happening. I want to be very clear when I start this presentation that I am not hating on honeybees. I promise. They are very, very important pollinators to agriculture. As you can see in some of the photos, they also nectar on native plants, will forage on native plants. They are managed pollinators. So, they're managed by beekeepers since the 1600s. And they really have been the figurehead for the plight of the pollinators, as we kind of refer to it. So when people think of save the bees, they typically only think of honeybees, and maybe occasionally bumblebees, but I'm going to talk about the wide diversity of native bees that most people don't know about. So although I'm not going to be talking about honeybees during this talk, I want to talk about the 4,000 species of native bees that we have in North America that actually don't produce honey like honeybees do. So first things first, I wanted to clarify that honeybees are generalists, and a lot of our native bee species are specialists. So on the left, obviously, we have the honeybee. They're generalists, so they forage on a variety of non-native and native plants. They aren't particularly picky, but they have a very sophisticated social structure, which is really, really interesting. And I know that there's a lot of great talks that are on that if you're interested in learning more specifically about honeybees and their decline. On the right, we have a squash bee, which is one of our native bees, and they're specialists, which means that they only nectar and forage on either a certain species or a certain genus of plants. So they are limited by what's growing in their habitats. So native bees, I already kind of let the cat out of the bag, and there's approximately 4,000 species of native bees that we have here. And our native bees have special habitat requirements. They do require foraging habitat. And remember, some are generalists like bumblebees, and some are specialists like those squash bees. They also require nesting habitat, and there's different nesting needs depending on the bee species that I'll go into a little bit later. And they also require overwintering habitat, which again depends on the species, but these are these special habitat requirements that honeybees don't necessarily require. So what is a bee? I know this is a graph of the anatomy of a bumblebee, but I think it's really helpful. So they actually have 2 pairs of wings, which means that there's 4 of them, as you can kind of see in the diagram, and I'll highlight a little bit later. They have 6 legs, so they're insects, and they have 5 eyes, which I actually learned for the very first time in a honeybee talk. So they have 2 compound eyes and 3 simple eyes that are on the top of their head. And they have pollen collecting structures, which are either corbicula or scopa. And I'll talk about those a little bit. And just so I can highlight the 3 simple eyes, they're at the top of their head, and they're impossible to miss once you know what you're looking for. So it's kind of cool, and it helps with orientation and flight and navigation back to the nest. So those pollen collecting structures, corbicula versus scopa. So remember, females are the only bees, just like with honeybees, that forage for pollen to feed the young. And males don't really have, they have no need to collect pollen for their young. So they will pollinate kind of by accident, but they do so because their bodies are so fuzzy, and you can kind of see how pollen covered everything is. And the other exception are cuckoo bees. So all of the different genuses of native bees have cuckoo species. So similar to like the cowbird, they don't provision their nests on their own. They actually are kleptoparasites. So what they do is they sneak into the other bees' nests and they lay their eggs. So they don't have the pollen collecting structures because they don't need to collect pollen for their young. And although that sounds bad, it's actually a sign of a really healthy ecosystem that you're able to support the different kleptoparasitic bees that exist. So this is just another picture kind of showing the differences for the corbicula and the scopa. Corbicula are kind of on the hind leg of a bee, and it's also known as a pollen basket. It's basically like a shiny little dome structure on the bee. So they'll collect pollen and mix it with either nectar and kind of pack it into a ball, which is sometimes referred to as bee bread. The one that is most recognizable, of course, are our many bumblebee species. And scopa are specially designed hairs that they can collect pollen in. So they're branched, and I really enjoy looking at these bees because they look kind of like saddlebags. And one thing that I forgot to mention on this previous slide, so scopa typically is on the legs, but some of my favorite bees, which are leaf cutter bees, on the bottom right and then bottom center, they actually have scopa hairs that are on their abdomens. So you can see the middle bee is foraging on purple prairie clover, and that pollen is orange. And you can see how the different pollen looks on the different scopa hairs. But those are leaf cutter bees, and they carry the pollen on their bellies as opposed to their legs. So moving on. So how to identify a bee versus a fly? So bees have longer antennae. Flies have shorter antennae. They have 4 wings, and flies are in the order Dioptera, which means 2 wings. So that's why, they have 2 wings. That's why they're named that. Bees have those pollen collecting hairs, so they're typically a lot fuzzier than our flies. And flies have very large eyes that almost touch. Personally, I think that the eyes and the antenna are the most identifying characteristics that I can see quickly, because even myself, I have problems differentiating the 4 wings versus the 2 wings. So I'll give you a moment to kind of take a guess to yourself. On the screen, I have flies and bees. So if you just like to think for a moment and guess which ones are bees, I'll just take a pause. So if you guessed that these 2 were bees, you would be correct. The rest of these insects are actually flies, and you can see how their eyes are a lot closer, but it's really the antenna for me. You can see that they meet, they're very short, they meet in the center of their head, and they're very close together. So it's more of a V. So that's what helps me, determine if it's a bee mimic or, an actual bee. And you can see that the colorations are kind of different. So when you're looking, if you don't know exactly what you're looking at, you might think that, a bee actually has 2 wings or just one set of wings. So I kind of highlighted that here. And then on this other side, that's kind of the line where you can see the differentiation. The hind wings usually tuck under the top wings. So it's sometimes difficult to tell, even in photographs. And then here's a bigger image of those flies. You can see how close the eyes come together and how short the antennae are. So switching gears a little bit, solitary versus social bees. More than 90% of our native bees are actually solitary, and this just means that each female of the species constructs and provisions her own nest without any help from other members of her species. And this typically means that native bees are less aggressive than honeybees because they don't have a nest to defend. I've gotten very up close and personal with a lot of native bees, and they're so busy foraging, trying to provision their nests, that they really don't pay me any mind at all. As for social bees, the other 10%, bumblebees are the best known native social bees. They have annual colonies that I'll talk about later. But there are 200 plus species of sweat bees that sometimes nest socially. It's a lot to get into, and honestly, I won't be able to tell you the correct terminology, but these differing social structures are not typically what is thought of when we think of honeybees and bumblebee colonies. So, bumblebees. There's 47 bombus species in North America. I really love them because they're so fuzzy and giant and easy to see and identify. But they form annual colonies. Unlike honeybees, only the new queens overwinter. So a queen only lasts a season, as does her colonies. The graph at the bottom kind of shows the emergence of them all. So the new queens that emerge from overwintering go off and find a nest site. Then she forages to do her first brood of worker bees, which of course are all females. And after they start building their colony, the males are produced later in the year, as are the new queens that will go off and create their own colonies the next year. Bumblebees are cavity nesters, so this means that they nest in tree cavities, under tussocks of grass, which is what is shown in the bottom photo, or they can use, more commonly, abandoned rodent nests that are underground. And bumblebees, one of the most kind of identifying things that they can do, one thing that makes them special is their ability to sonicate or use buzz pollination to extract pollen from anthers, which is the pollen producing part of the plant. I kind of like to explain it like a salt shaker. They're able to disengage their flight muscles from their wings and vibrate at a certain frequency to shake that salt shaker to extract the pollen of certain plants that require that. So one common thing that is typically used as an example are tomato flowers. So ground nesting bees, about 70% of our native bees are solitary ground nesters. So that is a vast majority of the bees. They dig in bare or sparsely vegetated soil. And again, it really depends on the species, but their nests can be on the flat ground to vertical banks, and their nest configurations range from very short tunnels to very complex branching tunnel systems. And this is also kind of where those sweat bees can nest somewhat socially. So wood and tunnel nesting bees. So 30% of our native bees are tunnel nesters. Sometimes they're called stem nesting bees as well, but they can use abandoned beetle burrows in standing dead trees. They can also chew out the pith of dead dry stems and twigs, like elderberry, blackberry, sumac are some examples, and I believe that Joe Pye weed is also a native that they can use the stems to nest in. And if you look on the bottom, that is an example of some brood cells of one of those leaf cutter bees that I showed you earlier with the pollen on their bellies. It's really fun because they can cut out circles of leaves or sometimes petals, and they basically wrap their babies up in it. So I like to think of them as kind of tiny bee burritos, which is kind of fun to think about. Our native bee populations are in decline. Earlier, I did mention that all pollinators are in decline, but particularly bees and butterflies. And this is because we really don't know a lot about our native bee species in terms of their biology and their populations and distributions. And it's really hard to monitor because since so many of them are solitary, it's sometimes difficult to find them. It's also difficult because some of the smaller species are unable to forage very far away from their nests, so they're kind of limited, whereas honeybees can forage, miles away from their hive. So 40% of our pollinator species may be at risk of extinction, but just to highlight some bumblebees, and I did steal this graph from Rich Hatfield with the Xerces Society. That was the third webinar that I recommended, but I couldn't do it any better myself, so I will give him all of the credit. But in North America, a quarter of our bumblebee species are in a threatened or near threatened category, and this kind of helps you visualize those 47 species. So why are native bees important? Why are we talking about them, when we have honeybees to also worry about? So native bees also provide those valuable ecosystem services that I'm sure many of you are familiar with if you're watching a webinar about bees, such as pollination, food resources, and yields. And also 80% of our native plant species depend on native pollinators and native bees for reproduction. And they do improve crop yields, of 75% of our crops, and they provide an additional $14.4 billion, worth of pollination annually. And honeybees, although they are very important crop pollinators, they're not the best pollinators, which means like they're not the most efficient pollinators for all crops and native plants. One thing is their ability, they're not capable of doing buzz pollination or sonication like bumblebees are. And different flower structures aren't as conducive to honeybees as some of the native bees that may be specialists and they only pollinate that specific genus of plants. So what is Arkansas doing? Switching gears, it's the Arkansas Monarch Conservation Partnership. I am the coordinator for this group. We formed in 2015, and it's a collaborative of conservation organizations, agricultural organizations, government agencies, businesses, academia, utilities. And here's just a sampling of our proud partners that work through the steering committee. And in 2018, they put forth the Arkansas Monarch and Pollinator Conservation Plan. So I'm doing a talk about native bees, but somehow monarchs made an appearance. Well, this is because, the steering committee felt it was important that in addition to creating habitat and, conserving these areas for monarch conservation, they wanted to include the plight of all pollinators, specifically our native bees. So if you want, the plan is available on our website, but it focuses on habitat conservation enhancement and restoration, research and monitoring, which I'll highlight a little bit later, outreach and education, capacity governance and funding, and collaborations and partnerships. The plan's really great. It's only, just a few pages long. I know it's under 30 pages, and you can find it at our website, arkansasmonarchs.org. So, native bees in Arkansas. It's the second webinar that I recommended by Coleman Little that is on our YouTube page. This is one of his collections that he uses to show really the diversity and the size differences of bees that we have here in Arkansas. So this represents approximately 200 species of bees. And we likely have between 400 and 650 species of bees, but there hasn't been an inventory. So we actually don't know how many native bee species we have here in Arkansas. We're working on it, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Although this is a pretty broad range, experts estimate that we have probably closer to 600 species. So again, this collection represents 200 bees. So times that by 3, and that's how many native bees we have here in Arkansas. And that's partially due to the unique ecoregions that we have across the state. So the plan, that plan that I talked about earlier, specifically mentions monarch and pollinator habitat. So really, what does that mean? So I really would like to take just a moment to clarify what I mean when I say monarch and pollinator habitat. It's habitat that is comprised of a high diversity of native species, plants that are native to Arkansas, and it covers bloom times throughout the entire growing season so that there is a constant supply of nectar and pollen that's available to those monarch butterflies and our native bees. They also have a high diversity of flower sizes, shapes, and structures, because the more diversity that we have in this planting, the greater diversity of invertebrates that we can support, and therefore the greater diversity of native bees that we can support with these habitats. It also includes those native milkweeds, which are great pollinator plants and of course are essential for the monarch life cycle. And really, when we say monarch and pollinator habitat, we want to let the public know that we're managing this habitat to benefit all pollinators and other wildlife, including bobwhite quail, turkey, deer, and other species that are in decline. So the plan does cover research and monitoring specifically. Basically, there's 2 goals that make up this section of the plan, and it's really just to increase and expand in knowledge for the needs of monarchs and our native bees, and also to expand monitoring efforts so that we can better do our conservation actions across the state and do valuable practices to protect them. So this subcommittee actually put together a pollinator research forum, which shockingly had more to do with bees and less to do with monarchs in the state. We're focusing specifically on native bees in Arkansas and trying to get a native bee monitoring protocol in the works. And then just in addition, they're also developing milkweed propagation protocols, because I know that that's a frequently asked question. So for native bee monitoring, we'd like to encourage people to download iNaturalist, and I'll hint at that a little bit more, but I just wanted to take the time to show this slide so that you can see just some of the diversity of Arkansas native bees that I've captured just in the last couple of years. So community science. iNaturalist is one of the best things that you can download for free, or if you have access to a computer or a smartphone, it's a website or an app on your phone. You can upload photos of native bees, and since you're going to be on the app anyway, I highly encourage you to join the Arkansas Monarch Mapping Project so that you can load observations of monarch eggs, caterpillars, and adults that you see in Arkansas. And that really helps us understand how monarchs are moving across the state and also using the habitat. And it also will help us get a better idea of what native bees are present in the state. And there's a breakdown that you can find on our website, arkansasmonarchs.org. There's actually 2 projects that are pulling the native bees data. So for your observations to be added to the Arkansas Monarch Mapping Project, you have to specifically add it. But if you're uploading photos of native bees, these projects are automatically pulling it if you have your geodata on, and it can see that you're in Arkansas and it's a bee. So how can you help? You can create habitat by planting Arkansas natives. And I just wanted to take a moment to say that monarch and pollinator habitat can have, a variety of different looks. They can be incorporated into existing spaces like roadsides and into solar arrays. There can be kind of a more native prairie restoration that is done by private landowners and done on public lands. You can have a pollinator garden that's very messy, and some people call them pocket prairies. Or you can have a more formal garden like the bottom right-hand corner that has native plants that looks a little bit neater. I personally prefer the pocket prairies, but that's just me. So to create native habitat, you need to reduce or eliminate pesticide use, specifically insecticides. But I want to make sure that people know that organic pesticides doesn't necessarily make them less harmful. In fact, some research has shown that organic insecticides can have greater impacts on pollinators than non-organic pesticides, but specifically systemic pesticides are key to avoid. So anything that's soil active or anything that the plant takes up, like neonicotinoids, that then become a part of the plant that can harm any pollinators or insects that consume the plant or consume the pollen and nectar. I also really want to encourage you to plant native milkweed species. On the right, there's 4 native species that we have here in Arkansas, and we actually have 21 native species. I think myself, I have collected 7 thus far. So I'm pretty excited to get started on my own habitat at my house. I really want to encourage you to include a variety of native plants. It used to be kind of the rule of 3 at a bare minimum. We used to encourage people to have plants 3 species that bloomed in the spring, 3 that bloomed in the summer, and 3 that bloomed in the fall. Again, to supply to ensure a constant supply of nectar and pollen to our native bees, because they are very early emergers, most species. And also spring and fall is when we see our migrating monarchs. So it's really important to pay particular attention to including those early and late blooming plants so that you can support our pollinators. But I really want to emphasize that minimum of 9 species is a minimum. And with the space that you have, I highly encourage you to maximize bloom diversity so that you can support a greater variety of these native bees and native pollinators. And also to be mindful when mowing and to follow guidelines for minimizing impacts on pollinators. The Xerces Society has some great mowing guidelines, as does the Monarch Joint Venture. So one thing that I wanted to really hit home, so that's why there's no pictures on this slide, I want you to be wary of any pollinator or butterfly mixes that you may see, just because you really need to read the label to see what species are included in the mix. And just because it says wildflowers doesn't mean that they're wild or native. And to be smart about what you buy and to remember, go native, grow native. The reason why I choose to include this slide is because a lot of people are tricked by marketing campaigns, which I feel is really dishonest. This is a wildflower pollinator mix that I saw at a big box store that shall remain nameless. And I just wanted to highlight that on the back of the bag, you should see a list of species that these mixtures contain. And just to highlight, just picking out some of the low-hanging fruit, Siberian wallflower, China aster, California poppy. Let's see. That's basically the lowest hanging fruit. So obviously these are not native to Arkansas. I'm sure that the pollinators really like these, but remember, these are probably mixes that are very showy and pop up fast, and they may support those generalist pollinators, but there's a wide variety of native pollinators and native bees that won't be able to really use these species. So just kind of be aware of that when you're looking what to plant in your garden to benefit pollinators. One thing that you can find on our website and also on the Arkansas Game and Fish's website, it's Native Gardening for Arkansas Pollinators. It's a really great little brochure. If you're near a nature center, there's also free copies available there. We also have a native plant care and maintenance guide that's meant to accompany our plant list that's kind of hidden on the right side of the screen. But basically, we have a recommended list of native plants to include in your gardens. Both of these resources are also available on our website. We also have some BMP documents that are available on our website. They cover a variety of different areas, but these are typically more catered to larger landowners. One resource that I always love to include in my presentations is the Missouri Prairie Foundation's GrowNative website. They have a lot of resources and free landscape plans available on their website, and it's grownative.org. But one thing that I wanted to highlight is that they have several different options for landscape plans, and they have really great names for them. But I wanted to highlight that all of the plans will benefit pollinators regardless of their name. Some are called like Butterfly Berm, Hummingbird Haven, or like Frog Pond or something like that, or, Formal Full Sun. And some people are mistaken thinking that they have to use the Butterfly Berm plan to benefit pollinators or anything like that. But because you're using native plants, you're going to be providing that valuable habitat for our native bees. I would just also be aware that I would say 90% of the species that they use are also native to Arkansas, but you should probably double check with either the USDA plants database or the Ladybird Johnson wildflower website. They have great plant finders, and you can find out if the plants are also native to Arkansas. For example, they have a blazing star species, which is Liatris is the genus, that they use in some of their plants that is not native to Arkansas, but there are a lot of really great native Liatris or blazing star species that you can use to substitute it out. But sometimes the hardest part is getting started, and the landscape plans really help with that. You can also certify your garden if you're interested. There's a lot of different options. National Wildlife Federation / the Arkansas Wildlife Federation has certified wildlife habitat. Monarch Watch, of course, has their Monarch Way Station certification program. One local one that we have is through the Arkansas Audubon Society, and they have a tiered bird-friendly yard. And even though it's bird-friendly, it's geared towards native plants. So again, you're benefiting those pollinators. And Wild Ones, which has a very active chapter in the northwest portion of the state. It's the Wild Ones Ozark chapter. They have a lot of really great resources, and they also have a native plant butterfly garden certification. So, bee houses. It's one question I get asked quite a bit that I don't have a lot of personal experience dealing with, but I wanted everyone to also be wary of those mass-produced bee houses. That's not saying that all of them are bad, but not all of them are great either. Sometimes they don't have the proper dimensions. They'll use really large pre-cut bamboo that is it's too big for those native bees to use. And if they're glued in place, they may not be able to be sanitized properly. I like to compare these kind of stem bundles or bee boxes with holes drilled in it as a hotel that may have a lot of visitors, but it's never cleaned in between guests. So that can be a vector for a lot of disease and fungal infections. So it's important to kind of be aware of that if you're going to choose to create habitat this way. And I highly recommend that you check out these two handouts that were produced by the Xerces Society. The one on the right is Nests for Native Bees. It's just a front and back, very simple handout. That's a great place to get started if you're interested in the different types of nests that you can do. But the one that I bolded in this little bullet point, the one on the left for tunnel nests for native bees, this is a lot more extensive, and it includes sanitation recommendations. And I highly, highly, highly recommend that you look at both if you're interested. They talk about different specifications for how you can make your own, or things to be aware of if you're looking to purchase one. And remember, the key message always comes back to planting Arkansas native plants. If you're interested in creating additional nesting habitat for these bees, I will not stop you. I will encourage you to do as much to support these bees as possible, but also try to be informed and make sure that you're not doing more harm than good by potentially helping disease spread throughout the environment. Because remember, most of our native bees are solitary, so they're not used to being clustered this closely together. So it's just about being educated about what you're putting out into the environment. And of course, you can always plant those native plants and create the habitat that they evolved next to. So this graphic was created by Heather Holm, and I really love to show it. She has a great website. I believe it's like Pollinators of Native Plants, but I'll talk about her books a little bit later. But this graphic kind of shows how you can help support those stem nesting bees. So over winter, you can leave those dead flower stalks intact. This helps provide seed for birds. And in the spring, you can cut back those stalks and leave the stubble so that the female bees can find these stems and start laying her eggs. in the different cells that she creates. And then in the summer, that stubble's hidden, which is lovely. And we're back to square one. You leave the seed heads over winter, and then in the spring you cut them back again, and the old stems will naturally decompose, so you don't have to worry about going out and sanitizing and maintaining those habitats that you're creating. And just remember that by planting these native plants and by benefiting our native bee species and monarchs, you're really benefiting a variety of wildlife, including our birds and moths and those other pollinators that I mentioned. So some recommended reads that I really love, and I cannot recommend them enough. The two books on the left are by Heather Holm. They have a lot of great information about native bees and their relationships with native plants. The third from the left is Attracting Native Pollinators by the Xerces Society. It's also very expansive and inclusive for how to create habitat, how to identify bees, life cycle details, etc. And then the book on the right is my personal favorite find. If you're really interested in learning more about native bees than you ever thought possible, I really recommend that you pick up a copy of this book. It is, I've had other people say that it was a really great coffee table book, but even my husband, who is not a biologist, was just really enthralled with looking at the pictures and seeing in-depth looks at the differences between bees and wasps and mimics, and just really seeing the diversity of native bees that we have in the world. And of course, it can't be a presentation without recommending both of Dr. Douglas Talmey's books. The first one is Bringing Nature Home, and his most recent book, Nature's Best Hope, is one of my favorite books to recommend. It's a short read and it's a great call to action. So even though the news on our pollinator populations declining is very gloom and doom, his book is really great at being a call to action and saying that it's not too late to help save our birds and our wildlife and our native pollinators. One quote that I love from him is, if half of American lawns were converted to native plants, it would equate the size of a 20 million acre national park, which is 9 times the size of Yellowstone and 100 times the size of Shenandoah National Park. And he also has a new website called Homegrown National Park that I encourage you to look up if you can. And if books are not your thing, if you like webinars, he also has a lot of really great webinars that he specifically talks about the key findings of his research that are included in this book as well. And if you're a landowner that's interested in learning more about cost share programs or receiving free technical assistance, you can contact your local either AGFC private lands biologist or your Quail Forever Farm Bill biologist, or you can email me and I can connect you with those local resources. Our Farm Bill biologists are partner positions with NRCS and AGFC. And what they do is they help landowners utilize those federal and state programs to create high quality habitat that benefit our native bees and monarchs and other wildlife, of course. And they provide free technical assistance. They write free management plans. And then there's a few other QF staff positions that we have across the state, like mine, that are statewide that help support landowners and do trainings. And as of last year, this group has really hit the ground running. They've created, I'm sure the number is well over 500 management plans now, but they've enrolled nearly 40,000 acres in Farm Bill programs and also the state cost share program, which is Arkansas Game and Fish's Acres for Wildlife, and still counting. So the key take-home messages that I want to share with you is to create habitat by planting a diversity of Arkansas native plants. And you can join iNaturalist and upload observations of native bees and monarchs. That would be helping me out directly So thank you in advance. And you can also volunteer for seed collection events or check out other community science opportunities. So there's a lot of great partners that work with the Arkansas Monarch Conservation Partnership, and we're proud to, help steer volunteers in their directions so that we can help further conservation across the natural state. Are there any questions?
All right. Well, thank you, Leslie. And I'm going to leave that slide up there with your contact info in case anyone has questions later. But I'll give people a minute or two to those still watching live to get their questions in. But what are a couple of your most frequently asked questions that you've had over the years?
So one question or comment really that I get quite a lot when people hear my title, pollinator coordinator. Again, most people default to thinking of honeybees as the only pollinator. And they ask if beekeeping is something that they could do to help save the bees. And I'm not discouraging people to becoming beekeepers, but if you want to benefit native bees, becoming a beekeeper is not going to directly help those native bees because you're really only helping your hive and, other, indirect consequences of the pollination services that they provide. I've heard that beekeeping is kind of equated to like raising chickens to help save the birds, which is a bit crude, but it's pretty accurate because honeybees are managed livestock. But that's just one thing. Again, the most important thing that people can do is creating native habitat by planting those native plants, which I think I've only said about 50 times. So people must know it's important by now.
Right. And can you think of another frequently asked question you get?
Sure. One frequently asked question that I get is, where can I find native plants? If you're in, I would assume that most people are in Garland County, but if you're in the Central Arkansas region and you're willing to drive to Little Rock, Audubon, Arkansas has 2 native plant sales. One is in the spring and one is in the fall. I believe their fall one just finished up. But if you're interested in creating a pollinator garden at your house, if you're converting lawn, you'll probably need to take a full season to eradicate any existing vegetation like lawn, Bermuda grass or anything like that. So it's probably a good thing because your site isn't appropriately prepped. So I recommend that you kill that existing vegetation before you start selecting native plants. And then you could go and look at the landscape plans and kind of figure out your layout, and then you can get a list of native plants that you want to include. A majority of the species that are available commercially are full sun, so you'll need to have a really sunny area. It's not impossible. The GrowNative website also has a formal shade example. They're just typically woodland species, so they might not be as showy as those pocket prairies, but you still can benefit those pollinators by planting those plants. And then you can also order seed from several different vendors. They're listed actually on that GrowNative website. A couple off the top of my head where you can buy native seed packets is Missouri Wildflower Nursery and Hamilton Native Seed Company, which are both Missouri companies. Brownstone Native Seed is also in Kentucky, I believe. And then if you're willing to drive a little bit further, of course, there's Marianne King, who owns Pine Ridge Gardens, which is in London, Arkansas. She was recently inducted into the Arkansas Game and Fish Foundation's Hall of Fame because she established that native plant nursery so long ago. But there's more native vendors that are popping up across the state. So native plants hopefully should be easier to find in the future. I also believe that Judy has told me in the past the master gardeners there have plant sales annually, and they do have native plants available there as well.
Yes, just to speak to that. We are specifically growing native milkweeds now so that we can get them in our plant sales. And they're doing a great job at the Detention Center Learning Greenhouse. So we're trying to do our part to get those natives out there. And this winter, we're really excited. We're going to be working with Leslie's group, and we're going to be doing a burn at the detention center and making a meadow. And we're really excited about that because we're going to be going through the whole process that Leslie just described. We're going to burn, we're going to get rid of the Bermuda grasses and things like that, and then plant with native seed. And they're being wonderful about planting about 4 acres. So we're going to be able to belong to Doug Tallamy's, native plant.
Homegrown National Park.
Yeah, the Homegrown National Park. It totally left me because I'm so excited about it.
I'm excited too.
So we'll be having some pictures about that and some more information about that. And once again, it's just like us, working with the library and putting in that pollinator garden in the courthouse. That also becomes part of the big scene for pollinators and making everything connect. So all I can say is thanks, Leslie, for the work that you do and all the information. I wish I could pick your brain more often. And we just all need to do just a little bit more. And if we all do a little bit more, a lot more will get done, I think.
Tina says, in the slides concerning the Missouri native plants, you mentioned another site that could help with finding native plants.
Yes. So you can either Google the USDA plants database, which is all caps, plants. It's an acronym. You can see you can look up a species either by common name or scientific name, and it lists the states that it's native to. You can also check out the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center. I believe the website is wildflower.org, but if you Google Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center, it should pop up. I believe it's called their plant finder, and it also lists the states that a species is native to. And if you have any questions about particular species, you can send me an email. There's another resource that I personally like to use, but it's a little bit more complicated. I really need to do a video for how to use it. But if you just want a quick answer, I highly recommend that plants database or the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center website.
And then we did get a question from Nell Ann. Does using fertilizer on your plants affect the pollinators?
So it doesn't. But one thing that I want to say is if you're doing native plants actually don't need fertilizer. In fact, it can actually kind of harm them or increase weed competition, particularly nitrogen. Remember, these native plants are adapted to Arkansas soil conditions. So those poorer soil sites are actually what those plants are adapted to. So I've seen certain native plant gardens where there's like these mutant native plants because they have so much, so much more nutrients than they're used to. They'll either get really big and topple over and then fall down, and that could kill them, or they just won't grow at all because it kind of overloads their systems. That's the simplest answer I can give. But if you're talking about just regular pollinator plants, I guess, that you're fertilizing, I can't think of any research or any anecdotes that I've heard of fertilizer directly harming pollinators.
If anyone else that was watching live or watches this in the future has any questions for Leslie Cooper, her info is right there on the screen. And I want to thank you both for being part of this, Leslie for your presentation, and Judy with the Master Gardeners for getting this set up. And I'm going to put another reminder here on the screen on the first day of fall, Wednesday, September 22nd, from 11 till it runs out. The Greater Hot Springs Beekeeper Association are going to be at the library in person selling honey. They'll have an observation hive, and they're also going to have some info on bee facts and conservation, specifically on the honeybee. But I hope you enjoyed learning about all the other native bees here in Arkansas besides the honeybee that Leslie told us about this evening. So before we leave, do either of you have any final remarks or info you'd like to share?
I have two last things, if I may, Judy.
Certainly.
Okay. One thing, if you're looking for plants, I highly recommend looking for straight species. So if you see a native plant name and a quotations after it, there's a chance that it's a cultivar or a nativar. And sometimes they're okay, but one example, if it's like a purple coneflower, sometimes you have to be a little bit careful because they're showy and pretty. They've been kind of genetically engineered to be not as beneficial to pollinators. For example, if you see a plant that's double petaled, it's basically like a cardboard sign, and it really doesn't have the nutritional value, or it may not produce nectar and pollen at all. The other thing that I will add is when you're creating that native habitat, remember you're benefiting our native bees and also honeybees. So they're not left out just because you're planting native. I showed pictures of honeybees that I took pictures of. So if you have any more questions, please feel free to reach out.
And I have nothing except thank you all for watching. Thank you for supporting the Know It to Grow It series. And we'll see you all again in October when we do our medicinal herbs of our ancestors. Please join us for that, October 20th at 6 o'clock.
All right, well, thank you. Have a good evening.
Good night.